Hello, everybody. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is your host, Valerie, and I am so excited to be back with you here again today because this is the beginning of a new series. And if you're listening to this, you're my people. You are my Latter-day Struggles 2.0 deep dive seekers. You are interested in the deepening of your faith journey. And if you're listening to this, it's very likely that you've been through the valley of the shadow in terms of your own faith crisis, somehow or other connected to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And maybe you're through with some of the worst disorientation around this part of your journey and you're hungry for more. You're wanting to know, okay, I've been through the disorientation of having to sort of die in some ways to your earlier understanding of spirituality, but maybe you're wondering, okay, where do I go now? Because for so many of us who are deeply spiritual, our Latter-day Saint upbringing is actually what put us on the path to the faith crisis. And sometimes we don't exactly know where to go after we have negotiated some of the more complicated details of that early part of the faith journey. And for that reason, I have committed a track or a half of this podcast to you and to me, because this is me on this faith journey as well, where I am interested in better understanding the depth and the breadth and the richness of spirituality that maybe I didn't exactly find or was not exposed to me when I was in my earlier stage faith. So we are going to be jumping more deeply into each and every one of these 5 tenets of radical wholeness. If you are deeper in your Latter-day Saint or connected spiritual journey and you're wanting more depth and breadth to your expanding spirituality, if you're wanting more access to your true self, if you're wanting to have firsthand experiences, knowing of your own divinity, it is through these 5 tenets that you can find some, I think, rich and deepening opportunities. But if you're here, to me, that says you have a motivation and a commitment to not only work through the faith crisis, but to do something that expands your soul. So here we go. Let's spend a few minutes talking about waking up. Waking up is sometimes called a peak experience, and so I feel pretty comfortable in saying if you're listening to this podcast, you have had or many waking up experiences. You have had something happen to you that was profound, where it's almost like your normal everyday consciousness alters a little bit, and you have a deep, impactful spiritual experience. This is a firsthand experience. If you have a waking up experience, you know what happened. It's not like somebody has to tell you about it. You actually know firsthand that it happens because it has a beginning and an ending. Something that I had never really thought about until I studied about this is that you'll have to think this through and see if this is something that feels right to you. With these peak experiences or state experiences, oftentimes maybe in the midst of them, it's more a profound and overwhelming feeling, or it's an experience that is deeply impactful to us, almost at the soul level. But frequently it isn't interpreted into directives or words, or maybe it eventually is. But in the height of this spiritual connection with something divine within us, connecting us to our divine, it oftentimes is ineffable. It's not interpreted per se. And yet, at the same time, when we step out of, or when this peak experience ends, frequently we move into a meaning-making frame and try to make sense of what that just was, what just happened there. Let's see how we can better understand ourselves and this. Let's see if we can better understand this situation by looking at the 4 perspectives. Okay, so let's go ahead and start, of course, at the my internal experience. I'll have you go first.
Okay. Yeah, so we both have actually family members that will be getting married here in the next, I don't know, a few months or so. Um, and so internal experience on a temple wedding, so first of all, I, I, I had a temple wedding and I thought it was very beautiful. Because at the time I was acting in a lower level of consciousness and not really thinking about all of my friends and family members who may not have been able to participate. But now that I am on the other side of not being able to participate, I think the initial internal experience was one of kind of sadness that weddings are intended to be opportunities to connect. And I feel like my ability to connect with the family at these times is limited. And so the internal experience is kind of sadness. Now, not necessarily of regret. I understand why I can't go to the temple. I understand that I believe strongly that you have been called and that I work with you to talk about pain points in the LDS church, and that got us in trouble. So I don't have an internal experience of like, oh, I regret my decision to be in this position, but I feel sadness.
Yeah. My internal experience is grief and a powerful feeling of injustice because of trying to live inside of integrity and virtue and being essentially estranged from family ritual for that. When we learn how to see four perspectives in every moment of our lives, we also learn how to imagine the internal or personal experience of another. It increases our capacity to have compassion for another. So not only am I able to understand myself better, but I am also increasingly able to understand another person is having their own internal experience that's different than my internal experience. And when somebody is deeply entrenched in one of the four perspectives, like in this particular case that Nathan's referencing, in the service of defending the organization or the structure, the true church, our personal pain and suffering, or our son's pain and suffering, the division of a family, wasn't considered. This is the warping that happens when all four perspectives are not seen in any given moment. In other words, to go forwards in development, we have to go backwards too. We can't just press forward and pretend like those things don't exist or that they don't get in the way or that they don't cost us energy, because they do. And it's challenging stuff. I do a decent job of working with people with trauma, and yet I have some of my own that feels like it's really sticky. And yet I persist because I feel to my core the reality that for us to grow and develop, having a healthy relationship with all of our wounds and all of our shadows is part of the wholeness journey. Even just acknowledging that we have wounds and shadows in and of itself, I think, is a marker of health. And the more we confront these things and love on our earlier selves and talk about them and address them, they become integrated with us, and we become more and more able to expand to higher and higher degrees of consciousness development, which is spirituality. That's what we're here for, is to remember who we always were. And this is part of the journey. So within Mormonism, there is definitely sort of a center of gravity, but there's a center of gravity culturally everywhere we go. And so as human beings are growing and developing, we're always sort of trying to trend towards deeper and greater degrees of consciousness. And therefore, at any point in time, as we're moving along, about 25% of the time, we're going to move a little bit beyond our own center of gravity or where the culture is. About 25% of the time, we might dip back into how we used to see things. And about 50% of the time will be kind of at the center of gravity itself, where we currently are sort of doing our psychological work.
And I think emotional underdevelopment in the church is really a big problem because, like I said, the men especially are taught to keep the emotional side of their development under wraps for sure. But then, like you said, when men begin to have some of these awakenings to their higher selves, they don't know what to do. They really literally think something's wrong with them. And so, yeah, this is definitely one of those, you're calling them lines of development. I like to call them categories of development. This is an area of development that becomes a really big surprise to people when this part of their soul opens up in the faith journey. Okay, so examples of how members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are frequently well developed in certain areas or categories of their lives, and in other areas they may be underdeveloped, would be somebody who is very, very intelligent and what we would call cognitively complex, but in their spirituality is still very literal mythic. Okay? So we all know people who in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are highly educated, very, very much leaders in their fields. I know just recently President Nelson died. Whatever your feelings were of President Nelson as the leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, very few people could argue that he was not a leader in his field. He was a very gifted surgeon, and he contributed a lot to the scientific knowledge around heart surgery. That is an unarguable point, okay? But we also know that President Nelson spoke about, for example, the temple garment that we wear is the exact same temple garment that Adam was given, right? And most of us who have moved into a place of more figurative spirituality, we believe, many of us begin to think of the garden narrative as a story that is not literal. It's a myth intended to teach good spiritual principles. I mean, there are definitely some things we can learn about the garden narrative, but many of us, if not most of us, no longer believe in the literal Adam and the literal Eve placed in a garden 6,000 years ago so that they could eat fruit, fall, and bring Satan into this world. And so I think that we can all think of in our own lives people who fall into this category. Really, really intelligent, good at what you do in your work, well-read, good lawyers, good doctors, great teachers, amazing scientists, historians. The church is full of really educated and motivated people, and also people whose spirituality still falls very much into the category of, if I drink coffee, I cannot live with God forever.
And so this work that we do, this communion with love and with reality, by growing into who we are capable of becoming in some ways, is strengthening who we are as divine selves, and paradoxically, it's also surrendering the self to love and to spirituality, to holiness, to divinity. So this ends this series about how we can find radical wholeness. I will assure you that this series is somewhat foundational, and we will refer back from time to time to these various aspects. You're going to hear me talk about, say, for example, shadow work. I've returned to that from time to time. That's an important part of psychological development. And now also we can be talking more and more about some of these other tenets of finding radical wholeness or finding healing, growth, and transformation through these various paths. So stay tuned as we tackle these concepts together. And if you want to read the book that I am referencing, it is called Finding Radical Wholeness. Thank you all so much for being here. If you're in my live fellowship, we will be talking about this as a community. It's such a fun, sort of organic book club sort of session where we just talk about what we're learning, how we're growing, what we're noticing, what our questions are. So if this is something that interests you, reach out to me at admin@latterdaystruggles.com. All right. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you later. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Struggles. If this podcast has supported your faith journey, we invite you to explore the many ways you can continue your healing and growth with us. On our website, you'll find support and processing groups, marriage and parenting courses, and free resources to support where you are in your faith journey. You can also join Valerie in the live fellowship gatherings throughout the year, where we connect, process the podcast, and build meaningful friendships with others on similar paths. If cost has ever been a barrier, we offer podcast scholarships funded by listener donations. To explore all of these offerings, visit the link in today's show notes or go to latterdaystruggles.com. And if this podcast has been meaningful to you, leaving a 5-star review is one of the most powerful ways to help others find this work. Latter-day Struggles is proud to be part of the Dialogue Podcast Network.
Dialogue Podcast Network.